Hey guys, welcome to the first video in my Sewing with Patterns series. In today's video, I will be sewing McCall's M7835, and I actually will be giving away a dress similar to this. So stay tuned later on in the video for more details on the giveaway. For today's dress, I'll be using this gorgeous sequins that I picked up from Joann's. It has small and large sequins. I will be using this stretch satin for the lining and the underlining of the sequins. You could also back your sequins with interfacing, but since mine is stretched, I decided not to go that route. You're also going to need some notions to make this dress. I use pins, a set of hook and eyes, grommets, just discard that. I decided not to do the lacing panels. You're also going to need an invisible zipper, some matching thread. You're going to need your fabric scissors as well as your paper scissors. You're also going to need your measuring tape, some bra cups, mine are D cups, and you're also going to need a 1/4 inch ribbon for your hanging loops. So I've cut out all of my pieces and I decided to trace my pieces onto tracing paper so that I wouldn't have to actually cut through my pattern. So that's all this is. I have piece 14 here, which is my skirt back, and I've cut it out of sequins and a lining. And I also took the hours and took all of the sequins out of the majority of my seam allowance just so that I wouldn't have an issue when sewing. I also took the time here to transfer all of my markings. Now I have a piece 13 here, which is my skirt front, and I've made a slight alteration to it by raising my center front by 4 inches. So I'm just showing you here that I raised it by 4 inches and I drew a new line there. I just connected my new center front to my existing side seam so that everything will still match up in the end. And I also raised my dot there that I had that corresponds with my ruffle piece. And I cut that from sequins as well as lining. And also it will be cut from the underlining for the sequins as well. Here I have piece 15 and I made a modification to it. I raised the center front of the piece 15 by the 4 inches that I raised on the skirt front as well, so that it would match the angle that my new skirt front has. And then I also just cut the remaining 2 ruffle pieces as the pattern recommended. And these are all cut on the fold. I also made some alterations here to my bodice pieces. I cut my center front piece out of the sequins on the fold instead of having a center front seam. And I left the center front seam here on my lining because it'll be easier to place my boning. Now I also converted my darts to princess seams so that I can help cinch in the neckline a little bit better. And I didn't make any adjustments to my back piece. For the bust line here, I cut a size 16, and for my waistline, I cut a size 18. And I just connected the lines and made a mock-up to make sure everything fit. Now I have my armbands here. I have them cut from my sequins layer as well as my lining. Now, this is when I decided to go ahead and underline with the satin because my sequins layer is actually really stretchy. So I did an experiment to see if underlining with this stretch satin layer would take some of the stretch away, and it actually did a little bit, so I decided to go with it. So at this point I went back and cut all of my main pieces that were out of sequins. I cut them out of lining fabric as well. So here I have all of my bodice pieces, and I have hand basted all of my satin layers to my bodice pieces, and now I'm ready for assembly. So step 1 is to go ahead and sew the darts, but here I have princess seams. So what I'm going to do is match my bust points, and then I'm going to pin up and down and sew my princess seams with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here I have everything sewn. Now I'm going to go ahead and clip into my curves so I can press it nice and flat. And when you have a princess seam like this, you want to make sure that you're taking notches out of it as well so that your seams lay as nice and flat as possible. Okay, so I finished step 1 through 4, and I also did step 5, which was pin bodice back sections to bodice front at side seams and stitch. And then I went ahead and pressed it open, and then I catch stitched down my seam allowance. And I'm doing this just to make sure that my seam allowance is laying nice and flat and not getting buckled up in between the layers. Okay, so I just popped it on my dress form to see how it looks, and it fits good. Excuse the waist. Right now, my waist is a little bit bigger than my dress form's waist, so that's why it looks like that. But I've done a mock-up, so I know that this fits me. And I just pinned it in the back. So I think it looks good, and I'm gonna go ahead and move on to my lining. Yeah, actually, I'm gonna pop this on me and see how it looks really quick. Okay, so I just tried it on really quick and it fits good, but I do think that I'm probably gonna take like 2 centimeters off of the back, and I'm gonna deal with that later. I'm just going to put the zipper in 2 more centimeters than I had initially planned for, and I think that would take care of that. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this to the side, and I'm going to work on my lining next. Okay, so here are my lining pieces. Excuse the wrinkleness of them, but I'm gonna go ahead and sew all of the seams together, except I'm gonna sew the side seams with the 2 centimeter seam allowance rather than a 5/8 of an inch, which is not that much of a difference because I wanted to take it in just a little bit. And then I'm also going to stay stitch around the whole neckline, and then I'll be back when it's time to put the boning in. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to put these hanging loops here in my side seams and just sew my side seams, and then I'm going to clip all of my curves and press everything open, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got my lining bodice fully assembled. I've clipped my curves and pressed everything open. My next step is stay stitch armhole edges of bodice lining. So I'm going to do the same thing like I did with my outer bodice, and I'm going to go ahead and actually stay stitch around the entire neckline here, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so I have my whole neckline stay stitched. Now step 5 in the bodice lining assembly says cut boning with casing the length of each side seam between upper and lower seam lines. Slide back casing and trim away 1/2 inch of boning on ends, rounding edges as shown. So what I'm going to do is actually, since I'm using ring boning that does not have any casing, I'm not going to worry about the casings, but I'm still going to sew it similar to the directions. So I'm going to, instead of just boning just my side seams, I'm actually going to go ahead and bone here. I'm going to bone up to the underbust point here. I'm going to bone my center front, same thing here, and I think we should be good. I'm also going to apply my cups in this as well. So let me go ahead and get my boning in my cups. Okay, so for this, I'll be using 1/2 inch wriggling bone, and I went ahead and pressed it as flat as I could before I insert it. I'm going to start by taking my measuring tape and my water-soluble side of my marking pen, and I'm going to go ahead and mark out my hem allowance here at the top all the way around because my stay stitch wasn't quite my hem allowance, and I want to make sure that my boning isn't going past that point here. I don't think that it needs an intermediate bone here at the side, but we will find out, won't we? So now that I have the top marked, I'm going to go ahead and also mark the bottom as well. Okay, so I've got my seam allowance at the bottom marked and my seam allowance at the top of each seam marked. Now for my princess seams, I'm going to go ahead and kind of turn it to the side here so I can see my bust curve. And I'm going to mark where my underbust should be. Now I'm going to go ahead and take my boning. Okay, so now that I have all of my bones cut, I'm going to go ahead and take them to my sewing machine. Well, first I'm going to press them all flatter again. I'm going to give them a nice press and press them flat. And then I'm going to put them onto my seam allowance, center them here on my seam allowance, and I'm going to catch them only down to just my seam allowance because I don't like to see my boning from the inside of my garments. You could sew it down like this so you would see your 2 rows of stitching on the right side, but I kind of don't like that, so I'm going to try it this way and see if it works. Okay, so I've got all my bones sewn on there, and it's just caught just to the seam allowance, so our right side is nice and clean, but we still have a fully boned bodice. So the next thing I'm going to do is install my cups. I love using cups. The pattern doesn't call for cups, but I love using cups to give the shape of the bust rather than using boning, and I think it's just softer and it looks a lot neater. Now that I've done that, is this the right one? Okay. Yeah. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and tack it to the bottom here. And then I'm going to walk it up and make sure that this is nice and smooth over the cup area. And then I'm going to tack it to the top. And I'm tacking it only to the seam allowance. Okay, so this is what it looks like once you have the cups. Like I said earlier, I just tacked it at the bottom at my underbust area and at the top where my seam allowance is. I did that on both sides. And I just turned them out because this is how they will be sitting when they're on the body. So now we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next step. I'm gonna put this to the side. Okay, so the next step are the armbands, and it is step 7. It says baste interfacing to wrong side of armband, and I'm not worried about the interfacing part because I've already backed it here with our satin, so that's pretty much step 7 done. And then it says for bodice with sleeves, bodice without sleeves is what we're doing. So my directions are turn in seam allowance on lower edge of armband and armband facings, press and trim press seam allowances to 3/8 of an inch. So pretty much what they want us to do, I'm going to turn this like this, and I'm going to press up my seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch, and then I'm going to go ahead and trim the top of my seam allowances down to 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so I have all of my armband pieces turned up 5/8 of an inch, pressed flat, and then trimmed down to 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now my next step is pin edges of armband to armhole edges of bodice, front and back, matching symbols, baste and stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and put my lining ones to the side. And I have my bodice here. Okay, so I'm going to pin these right sides together. So I'm pinning this here. I'm going to baste that, and then I'm going to flip it and pin it here, and then baste that, and then I'm going to also sew it down as well. So I'm going to baste it first, and then I'm going to sew it with a 2.5 millimeter stitch, and I'm going to do that for both of my armholes. Okay, so I've got my armholes, or my armbands sewn on. Now my next step is my next step is turn in seam and seam allowance on armhole edges of bodice, clipping necessary, baste, and press. So what I'm gonna do is flip this over, so that's my wrong side, and it wants me to turn this inwards. So the first thing I'm gonna do is trim it down a little bit. And then I'm going to clip into my curves. Okay, now that I've done that, I can turn it inwards by the seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch. Baste this down and press, but I'm not going to baste it. I'm just going to go ahead and put a pressing cloth over this and press it. Correction, I will actually baste this down because I just looked ahead in the instructions, and I think the basting will probably be the only thing holding this down. So I will actually baste this down, kind of like how I did the seam allowances, to keep everything nice and flat. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so I've treated my lining the same way as my bodice, except I basted it down instead of permanently catch stitching it down. Now I am putting my bodice and my lining right sides together, and I'm going to stitch around the whole neckline, including the armbands. I tried it back on the dress form to see how it looks with the cups in, and I like it. So I went ahead and understitched my seam allowance down to my lining layer so that it wouldn't flip out. Now it's time to assemble my skirt. So here I have piece 13, which is my skirt front here, and I have all of the sequins taken out of my darts. So I'm going to go ahead and sew my darts here. I did like a thread tracing here so that I can actually see my darts on the back layer. So I'm going to sew my darts for my skirt front with the sequins. And I'm also going to sew the skirt front darts of the lining as well. Here I have my skirt back, which is piece 14, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did for the skirt front. So I have my thread tracing here for my darts, and I'm going to go ahead and sew my darts for all of these pieces as well, including my lining. Now that I have my darts sewn, I have my skirt back pieces here, and I'm putting them right sides together. And I have my zipper here, and the blue marking you see is where my bodice stops. So I'm going to place this 5/8 of an inch down from the top edge, and I'm going to measure down to see where my zipper stops. And I'm going to place a pin there. And from there, I'm going to sew my center back seam. Now that I have my center back seam sewn, I went ahead and pressed it open as well. And I'm also going to catch stitch down that seam allowance. But before we do that, I'm going to sew my side seams. So I put my skirt front onto my skirt back, and I'm going to sew my side seams with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so I've got both my skirt lining and my main skirt assembled. I have everything pressed open, all my curves clipped, and I've also secured down my seam allowances of my center back seam and my side seams here on my main skirt. The next step is, with wrong sides together, pin lining to skirt, matching centers, base upper edge together between small circles. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. Okay, so I have my lining based to my skirt, and I'm going to take this time to go ahead and pull out all of my basting stitches here, and make sure to take out all your pins. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out the majority of my basting stitches here. You want to make sure that your basting stitches aren't coming up from the bottom though. So here it is, all my basting stitches are taken out. Now I'm going to sew my bodice to my skirt. Only the sequins layers. You don't want to catch up your bodice lining into this seam. So the first thing I'm going to do is match my princess seams to the darts of my skirt. And then I'm going to match my side seams and then the center back. And then I'm going to pin in between all of these points to make sure that my bodice is distributed evenly on my skirt. Okay, so I've done all the pinning. Now I'm going to sew this together with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here I have it all sewn, and remember we left this a little bit free at the back. This seam is pretty thick, so I'm going to go ahead and grade my seam by taking down some of my seam allowance for my bodice, and I'm pressing my waistline seam up towards the bodice so we can go ahead and cover it with our bodice lining when ready. So before we do that though, I'm going to go ahead and put my zipper in, and I'm going to hand baste my zipper in place, and then I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew it down permanently with the sewing machine. Make sure not to catch your bodice lining in this. And I gave it a try on, and I like it. I think it's nice, but due to the stretch of the fabric, I should have taken in a little bit more from the seams, from the side seams and the center back, but it will do for now. Here I have the skirt. I'm just showing you guys how clean it looks. It looks really clean on the inside as well as the outside. I have my hook and eye sewn on top of the zipper. Now it's time to finish this thing up. So I'm going to finish it by starting on my ruffles. Okay, so I have my first ruffle piece here, which this is the one that I altered and I made it 4 or 5 inches higher at the center front. And then I have my 2 regular ruffle pieces here that we just cut on the fold. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and combine all of these pieces. So I'm just going to sew them right sides together until I get a really long strip of sequin. So I'm going to sew one onto this side, and then I'm going to go ahead and sew the other one onto this side, and I'm sewing it together with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'm also going to sew our back seam closed. And then once I do that, I'm also going to run a gathering stitch, 2 rows of gathering stitches around the whole top of it, and then I will be back. So I have all of those seams from the ruffle piece sewn, and I have everything pressed open. I also made sure to sew my hem of my skirt so that I don't have to worry about that later. Now I'm matching my center front of my ruffle piece to the center front of my skirt. I'm also going to match my side seams and my center back seam. And then I took it over to my sewing machine instead of previously sewing 2 rows of stitching like I previously said. And I just gathered it down by hand so that it can be more even and so that my threads wouldn't break while I tried to gather it because all of the sequins. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. The next step after that is to turn up your lining, your skirt lining 5/8 of an inch, and slip stitch it down to cover up the seam, and you're all done. This is the finished dress. I think it is absolutely gorgeous. If you guys want to enter for a chance to win this dress in your size, all you have to do is share this video, follow me on Instagram, and comment done in the comments on this video when you're done. Thank you guys so much for watching my video. I appreciate you more than you know, and I'll see you in my next one.